One of the biggest issues facing storytellers is how to combat mis and disinformation. Planet Forward's Erin Dye talked to Sadie Babbitt, NPR's climate editor, about this very problem. We wanted to show you a piece of that conversation.
Your mom is on Facebook and sees this thing about renewable energy and is like, oh, that's really interesting, and like shares it in her space, and then other friends share it, and like that's really innocent and not intentional at all, and that's misinformation. Misinformation is unintentional and disinformation is intentional. Misinformation, especially in the climate space, and disinformation is everywhere. And it is really hard to parse through and figure out like what is real and what is not, right? As journalists, it's really hard to decide, and editors to decide what to go after. Like when does something that is wrong, a false narrative, rise to the level of reporting? And there are a couple of different approaches to take, because you can't do all of them, otherwise you're going to be playing a game of whack-a-mole. One way is to debunk the mis and disinformation. And there's some easy ways to do that, starting with the headline, like get the right information into a headline. And we see a lot of this happening across climate reporting, where you often see like a headline that says like fact check and then the truth, right? The other thing is, if you can get ahead of misinformation or disinformation, what is called pre-bunking in your story, right? So for instance, let's say there is going to be a city council meeting on a solar array that's going to be going into a popular neighborhood. And it's controversial because people don't want it to be in their backyard. You can know as a journalist, talking through with your editor, like, okay, what are some of the questions? What are some of the themes that are going to emerge about this, right? So you're going to have the NIMBY narrative come up, like not in my backyard. And you're going to have like lies about solar panels, and it's an eyesore. And so you could actually, as journalists, I think this is a great space for us to take on those questions, maybe even engage your audience on what they want to know about that city council meeting that's coming up. Use that to guide your reporting and get ahead of the mis and disinformation that will come out of that city council meeting.
The full conversation will be posted on planetforward.org, and Frank has just shared with me that Sadie has a book on the subject coming out soon, and will be here next year to talk about the book. So lots more there to learn. You'll have a chance to see Netta back up on stage to moderate another conversation, but right now I would love to invite to the stage Halle Parker, Teak Root, and Kunjal Bastola, please. Oh, you're so kind. Thank you. How are you this morning?
Doing pretty good. How are you?
I'm well. We had a Zoom conversation, but we haven't seen each other in person, so it's so lovely to do so.
Yeah.
I've got a little bit of feedback. Okay, good. Thank you for being here. It's great to be in DC with you all in person. One of the principles of conflict transformation is to allow people to speak for themselves. And so as we talked about how to do these introductions, we thought that we would start by having you introduce yourselves, anything about your experience that you want to share with the audience, and share a story with our audience that helps speak to this theme of embracing nuance. Halle.
Lovely. Thanks, Sarah. Hi, I'm Halle Parker. I am a health reporter for Verite News. I actually just started that job last week, and before that I was working as an environment reporter for New Orleans Public Radio. I had also covered the environment for other newspapers in the area in Louisiana. And I really have tried to emphasize, to do my work with an environmental justice reporting lens. So that means really trying to think about the power structures involved with the conflicts that I am reporting on, and trying to interrogate the narratives put forward by folks with more power, like perhaps state officials or chemical companies, and make sure that I'm elevating the voices of residents who might have less power. So to that end, the story that I wanted to talk about was one that I've been covering for a few years now. It revolves around a grain terminal proposal in a historic Black community. This grain elevator was proposed on the same land that the This grain elevator was proposed on the same land that the residents of the community, their ancestors had been descended from slaves who were working on that area. So they were very much against this plant, but down the road, there was another historic Black community that was very much in favor of this plant. They were looking for economic revitalization, the idea of jobs coming to this area that has remained pretty rural, and unlike a lot of the rest of the Mississippi River in Louisiana, it was uninterrupted by industry. And so in trying to think about this conflict, there tends to be this false binary in Louisiana that when it comes to health versus jobs. And so I'm really trying to challenge that binary by putting forward not only just what is actually happening with the conflict between these two communities, which are unique because they are actually interrelated. There's a very close familial relation. So when it came to discussing what the future would be with this plant, this was turning father against son, cousins against aunts, all of those different relationships. So as a reporter coming into this community, I'm trying to not only look at the actual conflict at hand, but also try to help talk about what the visions for the future could be. So that meant kind of challenging whether this industry is the only option or whether, there could be the opportunity for historic preservation to be a path forward, as was being presented by some residents, or pipelines into other industries. So I think part of our job is to be able to, again, just make sure that we're not falling into those simplified narratives that are being put forward, and at least doing our best to sort of try to bring some unity to these situations, because there had been no discussion of any sort of unified vision for this community moving forward.
Thank you, Halle. Teek.
Yeah, hi, my name is Teek Root. I cover climate change at Grist, a nonprofit newsroom, and I was formerly at the Washington Post. I am particularly interested in the economics of climate change because I think the dollars and cents are really ultimately going to be what moves sort of a transition at a scale that is necessary. And then I actually want to talk about a story that's a little bit not economics, actually, but it's about electric lawn equipment. And so so historically, I have found that the idea of electrification, electric cars, electric anything, tends to be politically polarized. Conservatives aren't a huge fan of electric cars, and I have a family member who's slightly right of center, slightly center, and you cannot get them to talk about electric cars. But I found that electric lawn equipment is actually a really interesting touch point that has cut through a lot of this. And so I ended up doing a story in Birmingham, Alabama, about how a suburb of Birmingham was trying to go all electric with their lawn equipment, and they were so excited about it. There's health benefits, they didn't have to use gas. There were just like a litany of things that I found that they were just like glad to talk about electrification in a way that I really wasn't expecting. And so I like to do climate stories that people don't really know are climate stories. They're sort of like accidental climate stories, right? Like the electrification of muscle cars, for example, is one that is sort of a sports car story more than it is a climate story. And I think those finding those touch points that sort of cut through the conflict, I found are really helpful and ones I seek in my work.
Thanks, Teek. Kunjal.
I'm Kunjal Bastola. I'm a student at Northwestern University, also a Planet Forward correspondent for this year. The story I want to talk about is I was studying abroad in Copenhagen in the fall semester, and with my class we took a trip up to Norway, to Tromsø, so part of the Arctic Circle, and while there I decided to do a story on salmon farming and the sustainability of salmon farming, specifically on sea lice, which has been affecting salmon populations. And the thing about that story was there was different kind of people involved with it. So if we're talking about simplified narratives, there are the people who are critics of salmon farming and critics of some of the technologies and chemicals used, but also I spoke to people I spoke to someone at a family-owned salmon farm company up there in Norway, and just like hearing from their perspectives of how they do care for the fish and how they do have a relationship with the fish. And there's just different perspectives that I feel like I wanted to amplify and not just look at it and report the story through one angle, or maybe the angle that I saw or knew best. Because I mean, I hear about the unsustainability of salmon farming a lot, and I wanted to make sure that I wasn't going in there with just that one narrow-minded focus and just hearing everyone's different stories regarding this issue.
It's been so great to learn about the powerful stories that you all are telling and getting past those binaries, thinking about complex or unexpected narratives. As we were talking about this idea of embracing nuance, one thing that Kunjal brought to our conversation was that sometimes the people that we're talking to are giving us simplified narratives. And so maybe we'll go the other way down the panel. I'm wondering, as journalists, how do you understand how you should have a responsibility, or practically how to respond to simplified narratives that are given to you by subjects?
Yeah, that I was thinking about that in the context of I spent a quarter or a semester here in DC reporting on Capitol Hill as an environmental reporter through a school program, and a lot of what I was doing was going to like congressional hearings and just reporting on those. And I think I started with just kind of regurgitating what was being said at these hearings by lawmakers, and I realized that I wanted to not just cover what was being said or what like lawmakers were saying, but talk to the people being impacted in these communities. And so, for example, I did a story on Biden's deciding to restart construction of the border wall, and I spoke to people on the ground living in communities in Starr County, Texas, because I didn't want to just, quote from a press release or quote from what was being said at the hearing. I think it was important to kind of embrace those other perspectives of the communities actually being impacted by what is happening here in DC. And yeah, I really wanted to place an extra emphasis on amplifying some of those voices.
Yeah, I would say my simple answer is talk to more people. If someone's giving you a simplified narrative, there's somebody else out there who has another point of view. And I tend to ask people at the end of an interview who disagrees with you that I should go talk to. And sometimes they answer, sometimes they don't. But the problem I'm running into more and more is that people just don't even want to talk. So I emailed the Department of Interior the other day for a story, and their comment was literally, a leftist blog's interpretation of federal policy is not a matter of concern. And so I am still trying to figure out how to deal with responses like that. Or like the Heritage Foundation will never respond to my emails. This is a bigger problem that I'm sort of still sorting out how to, but my general response is just to talk to more people.
Yeah, I was going to say something along a similar vein, just in terms of talk to more people, read more, do more research, and just emphasizing the importance of context in our stories, and making sure that we're, going deeper than just what we're being told.
Such a challenging moment if the stories that we're trying to explore are not being shared with us, right? Or we're being given very simplified narratives. How do you understand the responsibility of journalists to represent diverse interests, the many different resources that folks are working with, and the perspectives of the stakeholders in these complex stories that you've shared with us?
Yeah, I can start us off. I think it goes back to, at least the framing that I use in terms of trying to look at where the power lies and how to balance the perspectives that are involved, especially if someone, like say a resident, has concerns about an industrial plant that I'm covering that's on the fence line, and if those concerns are then also backed up by a researcher who says, yes, it makes sense, and there's this, these studies to show that this pollutant does have a reason for concern. And then I go to, which then, I will go to a chemical plant and say, look, these concerns exist. What are you doing about these emissions? And if they then say, this pollution does not pose a problem, then I'm not going to necessarily, I'm going to, of course, include their perspective, but I'm not going to put that as high in the story. For me, I'm going to flip that narrative and put the residents' concerns, the research ahead of that, and then include the industry's response to it. And I don't think that there's necessarily a need to have those completely balanced in terms of the amount of space given to those voices, just because some of them have more credibility. And I think that for me too, I'm also trying to challenge the traditional way that we have maybe told stories or maybe marginalized populations have been represented. So I feel like this is one way to kind of go about that practice with our journalism.
Great.
Emphasizing who's being impacted the most.
Yeah, so you're using your expertise and your understanding of the context to think about whose voices haven't been heard and which you might foreground in your narrative.
Exactly.
Yeah, great. Teague.
Totally agree with Halle. And I would add just this idea of randomness I really like. Like if I go into, like obviously it's the community itself is maybe not random, but like door knocking where I have no idea who I'm gonna pick up, or like going on Lexus or Google Maps and finding an address, finding a phone number, and just cold calling people. Like I think this is really important, and I think it's one of the things that's kind of under threat with declining news budgets, is if journalists don't have the resource, and time is a resource, to go and do these things, or Lexus, or like, you know, mileage budgets to go drive somewhere. Like, I think it's a real risk we're running in regard to like diverse perspectives as resources get crunched. It's going to get harder and harder to do that.
It's so interesting. I think in his book, #Democracy, Cass Sunstein distinguishes between an architecture of choice and an architecture of serendipity. And when you talk about randomness, right, it is that idea of running into ideas and perspective that you haven't encountered before, right? How do we use the limited resources or within our resource constraints to choose new things and new stories that perhaps haven't come across our radar before? Yeah, really interesting. Kunjal.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what both of you were saying. And like, when I write stories, I try to focus on those voices that aren't being heard. And I think it also starts with like, I mean, I'm in college and like I'm learning and developing my skills, and I want to be a journalist that focuses on environmental justice or like equitable journalism and working on amplifying some of those voices. And so, yeah, definitely like what Halle said about speaking to everyone, but like putting those voices that aren't usually heard up maybe at the top of my story, or like emphasizing those, and just making sure that I'm not neglecting any perspectives that might be important to the story, or neglecting those people who are impacted or might be.
Earlier, Netta spoke about the issue of tension that comes up as we're trying to navigate complex stories. And I was thinking about this morning. There's a situation where I would like more information about what's going on, and yet there's an enormous amount of uncertainty. And my brain does not like uncertainty. I like black and white. And we talked about one of the practical considerations for journalists of how to respond to audiences, perhaps like me, that want simple stories, right? That want simplified narratives about what's going on. So as you all think about the mediums that you write in, the audiences that you're writing for, or maybe your different goals or understandings of your role, how do you think about that challenge of knowing that your audience might want a simple story, but you know that there's more that's behind that?
Yeah. Teague, do you want to? Okay, I'll go first. I was especially interested in this question because I did work for 3 years in public radio, and radio is truly a media for the masses. So I'm really trying to speak conversationally, simplify my stories. And so trying to get that nuance and context in there was a different challenge. I wanted to bring up one example of a story that I did about natural gas exports in the US. And I found that it helped that I was able to do a 3-part podcast series about that. So that was able to bring in some more time and space to explore. But also I think within that series, trying to show, you know, the gas industry and what effect it was having on residents on the Gulf Coast, as well as residents and communities all the way over in emerging Asian countries. I think what really helped in terms of trying to still keep that nuance, despite needing to also keep it simple, was to do more showing versus telling, and really being able to, I got funding from the Pulitzer Center, so I was able to actually, you know, obviously go to Louisiana, but go to Europe, go to Japan to bring listeners to these places and actually be able to see these conflicts taking place.
Yeah, I would add to that, I think headlines and decks can be simple, but that doesn't mean your story has to be simple. Like I think there's a reason like people click on sort of flashy headlines, but the story doesn't have to be. And actually, this isn't a climate story, but one that was funded by Pulitzer Center too. But I was in Rwanda and we were doing a story about entrepreneurialism in Rwanda. And it had been done a lot, and in theory, it was a very simple narrative, right? Rwanda was an entrepreneurial country. But as we were there, we kind of talked to people and learned that it was kind of state-forced entrepreneurialism. Like the government, authoritarian government was basically saying, look, you have to be entrepreneurs. And so we headlined the story Startups for the State. And it was like a simple headline, but the story was actually really complex. So it's a distinction I would make.
Kunjal, you get the last word.
Yeah, I think that you mentioned like sometimes people want the simplified narrative, and maybe it's because they don't know that there's more to be said, and so even if that's what they're looking for, like I think it's our role as journalists to kind of expand those perspectives and expand that narrative so that the people know, oh, there's different interests and different kind of stakeholders involved in these stories, and so that kind of pushes everyone's horizons open as well. So
Yeah.
that's what I'll end with.
Get the attention of our audience and then tell them a complex story with nuance. Yes. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.